I'm Frank Vaughn, and it is June 5th, 1984. It's actually not 1984. It just feels like it. It's 2025. But the 75th anniversary edition of 1984, George Orwell's book, which arguably warns about the world we're living in today, is out there in circulation and is a bestseller. But it should be noted that it contains an introduction in which you will learn, as Walter Kearns says, that the current leading paperback version of 1984 has an introduction, a trigger warning introduction, calling the novel's hero problematic because of his inherent misogyny. But it actually gets worse than this if we go to the introduction itself. The introduction laments that Jews, Negroes, South Americans of pure Indian blood are to be found in the highest ranks of the party, and administrators of any area are always drawn from the inhabitants of that area. In no part of Oceania do the inhabitants have the feeling they are a colonial population ruled from a distant capital. When I read this, the introduction's author says that they cannot help but think of Ralph Ellison's Invisible Man in its publication in the United States just a year after 1984 was published in Britain. In Ellison's novel, whites don't see blacks, while in Orwell's novel, there are no black characters at all. As a contemporary reader, I find myself pausing again. And then further on, in a 1945 essay, Antisemitism in Britain, Orwell frankly criticizes anti-Semitism among his British contemporaries, but in other documents he is guilty of the very anti-Semitic marks that he disapprovingly notes in others. So instead of introducing this quintessential work, warning the world of the perils of totalitarian ideologies, we're treated to a lesson filled with ideology itself. The author of said introduction further writes, I'm enjoying the novel on its own terms, not as a classic, but as a good story. That is, until Winston Smith reveals himself to be a problematic character. And in what way is he problematic? For example, we learn of him that he dislikes nearly all women, and especially the young and pretty ones. Winston's views on women are at first despicable for the contemporary reader. He's the kind of character that can make me put a book down. Imagine if Orwell had have just wrote Winston's character as a woke liberal living in modern times. You wouldn't even need Ingsoc and Big Brother to do the ideological policing. He could have just self-policed, and the book could have been a lesson on how the citizen can save the government time. And before we move on to the next thing, forgive me if I sound a little nasally. My throat is sore, my nose is congested, and it's not because I got a cold. It's because some of the thickest wildfire smoke that I've ever experienced has enveloped the house. It seems to be clearing off now, but its effects linger. At any rate, in a lament, since we're doing that today from a progressive, DEI retreat leaves many in the lurch. It wasn't long ago that countless major corporations were rushing to beef up their diversity, equity, and inclusion departments, only to subsequently beat a hasty public retreat just a few years later, when they realize there's no money in virtue signaling. The only money for a company is found in merit and being able to develop and market products and services that people want to buy. Nobody cares what the person who's selling it to you looks like, or what their individual ideology is, or if they're two-spirited. They just care about the product and the capacity of the person selling it to them. The sudden shift has left many professionals, quote-unquote professionals, in the once thriving sector with dwindling and uncertain career prospects, the NPR reports. According to Revelio Labs, more than 2,600 DEI positions have vanished since 2023, with the cuts disproportionately affecting women and people of color. I will just have to shed a tear for the poor woke warriors who can't seem to get gainfully employed. It turns out that being perpetually aggrieved is not enough of a marketable skill set to keep one gainfully employed without intense public, that is government, pressure, and public financing. Moving on to more important things, I know. World War III, it's so boring. Nobody's really into it, but we got to talk about it just for a minute, so bear with me. Kremlin. No negotiations with terrorists. Will retaliate at a time of our choosing. Putin had an hour and 15-minute phone call with President Trump. Trump came out of that phone call convinced that Russia is going to strike Ukraine very hard over the fact that their sitting in stationary strategic bomber fleet was hit in that drone strike that we discussed in a previous video. It seems that NATO is prepared for that. It seems that Trump is prepared for that. And hopefully, as it plays out, there isn't further escalation on the part of the West. Because without the West's logistical and weapons support, Ukraine could not have possibly conducted that strike. Again, the world rests on Russian restraint in the face of continuous escalation and provocation by Western nations. It's not even a point of contention. If you think that NATO is a defensive alliance in 2025, I have oceanfront property for sale in Saskatchewan that you might be interested in. Now, related to this, did you know that there's a channel on YouTube exclusively dedicated to recruiting people from the international community to fight in a neo-Nazi legion? Absolutely. And here it is. The Azov Brigade. They have 118,000 subscribers, not bad. Their videos of violent conflict sometimes achieve 1 million views. But we have what's inside a German MRE, what's inside a US MRE, and more importantly right here we have, want to join Azov? Would you like to go fight in a neo-Nazi brigade? Now, there is a bunch of media out there that is trying to fly cover for the Azov Brigade, saying that they have been maligned and they have been mislabeled. You can't believe it. We're talking about a propaganda ploy. These are people that march in military-style parades filled with Nazi iconography. They have been captured, tattooed as they are with swastikas. There's media out there, and I've talked about this in my other video, how I reviewed a book that I haven't quite finished yet, but it was written by a Ukrainian man, exposing how Stephen Bandera and other nationalist heroes of the Ukrainian nation, of this current Ukrainian government, are themselves bona fide neo-Nazis who participated in mass killings in Western Ukraine. It's a matter of history, and anybody telling you otherwise, they often say that it's propaganda, that the thing that I'm saying is Russian propaganda. We're talking about history. They are the propagandists. But the fact is, Azov used to be restricted. The U.S. government used to sanction them. They were limited on social media. But because of political expediency, bona fide neo-Nazis are allowed to recruit for warfare in the open, and even allowed to post their war footage, complete with corpses and everything else. Now, they're censored out and they're grayed out, but this is ongoing. Do you think on YouTube there is a Russian equivalent YouTube channel? In a related note, this was a comment from my website. Hi, Frank, I love your work. At times, it's like you put my own thoughts into words better than I can do it. Just want to point out, without casting any aspersions, that the only passage from the article that you unintentionally missed reciting is, in addition, the Integrated Terrorism Assessment Center recently warned the Canadian government that Canada will likely experience a lone wolf terror attack soon, and anti-Semitism is the overwhelming motivating factor. Thanks for your work. And I just want to make a note here that I'm not sure what article this person's referencing, but it should be apparent from my previous work that the only people agitating on our streets right now when it comes to the Palestinian-Israeli conflict are the Palestinians. They're destroying property. They're blocking our streets. They are targeting Jewish-owned businesses that have nothing to do with the conflict whatsoever, and making it difficult for people to patronize them. They are racially targeting Jews. They're not necessarily just targeting individual Jews that have links to Israel, Zionism, or the Israeli army. It is carte blanche. So it makes sense that eventually, since we enable this behavior, since we celebrate this behavior, since we bring people over and give them big fat government checks, and allow them to ride roughshod over our civil order will eventually lead to some kind of terror attack. But this brought up a good point. This has been sitting on my desk for a while, and I'm going to show it now. This is a documentary. If there's any doubt in your mind about the extent and scale of the Holocaust, you should watch this documentary. Because every now and again, you encounter people who say that the entire thing didn't happen, that it's fake news. Well, this, and I'm not going to link this, you can read Inside Dachau, Hollywood's Darkest Footage, Uncensored. This is a documentary with some of the clearest footage that you're ever going to see, and it is not censored. You will see trainloads of bodies. You will see unspeakable human horror. If you need to see this to convince you of the historical veracity of the excesses, to put it lightly, of the National Socialist regime, socialist was a huge part of what they did. This notion, this idea that it's fake news and historically inaccurate to label the National Socialists as a socialist movement and to remind people that fascism itself had a huge socialist component, nationally bound, not international. But I digress. If you need a reminder, this is just one, but this is uncensored. It still remains uncensored. Nothing's blurred out. If you need to be convinced that this historical event actually comprises history. Now, I was recently talking to a Jewish friend of mine whose grandparents miraculously survived the concentration camps, and it mimics a conversation I've had many times in my life with valued Jew friends that I have, because I'm not a raging anti-Jew. I'm not anti any people. I'm anti-ideology. I can highlight the flaws of any system. I can highlight the flaws of any religion. But it's like I speak in terms of, it's like when I talk about boomers and how the 65-plus crowd handed the election to the liberals, but I'm always cautious and provide the caveat that there are millions of people in the 65-plus age group that did not vote for the Liberal Party. I am sure there were millions of Germans who were absolutely appalled, who were alive at the time of World War II, that for one reason or another were powerless or felt powerless to do anything to stop what was happening. And it's the same today for anywhere you look in the world. But I digress. I'm always going to be curious. What happened in Russian, Soviet-occupied territory as Eastern Europe was liberated and it fell under the hammer and sickle? What happened at those concentration camps that the Soviets supposedly liberated? And how much liquidation of their own did they do? This is one of those great big holes in our understanding of the war. We have a pretty good understanding of what the Allies did on their side of Europe, but all we have for Eastern Europe is the Soviet story, which the Allies were happy to rubber stamp because everybody was getting along. Everybody was united in the quest to defeat Germany. But did the Soviets liquidate thousands, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of prisoners in those concentration camps themselves? It's a very real possibility. The Soviet Union was a far bloodier force with a much bigger footprint than Nazi Germany. And communism itself likely killed 100 million people or more on this planet. Yet here in Canada, you can sell a beer. I believe it's called Bolshevik Bastard, is what I think it's called. It was a beer I seen in Ontario. Hammer and sickle on it. You can walk around wearing a hammer and sickle t-shirt. You can get tattoos with the hammer and sickle. You can be a public advocate for communism. You can even have an affiliation with an official communist party right here in Canada. And why can you do that? Because they were our friends in the Second World War, And just like the shadow of appeasement, as I talked about a couple videos ago, as applies to Russia today, this idea that if you appease Putin by delivering peace in Ukraine, he'll take over all of Europe. It's the shadow of the Second World War's psychology. It's the story that came out of the war that is still being perpetuated. And that's why communism is still allowed and tolerated, even tasteful in some circles. You could not get away with selling a beer that had a swastika on it. And I'm not saying that you should, but I think the double standard really highlights something about our society, that our morality is selective. If we didn't have enough evidence of that already, this is just more evidence of the very same. But it brings to mind that question. What actually happened in the Soviet-liberated territories? Now, we do have some answers in the form of what happened in Ukraine in the wake of the liberation, under people like Bandera. That's a subject I've discussed before. It's a subject I'll discuss again. It's outside the scope of this video or this segment. All I really want to say in this segment is the Holocaust happened. German hands were responsible for it, but there might have been another component that remains unexplored due to political expediency, the shadow of the outcome of the war. Moving on to something more contemporary, such ingratitude. Musk rages after Trump comments, says without me, he would have lost the election. There's no doubt that the Musk endorsement was very critical, and once he was endorsed, once he had issued his endorsement, Musk worked very hard for the president, particularly in Pennsylvania. And this is one of those times where Donald Trump's nature is absolutely repulsive, even to members of his own base who have a little bit of clear sight. Elon Musk is now raging on X against President Trump after Trump talked greasy to the press over Musk's opposition to the Big Beautiful Bill over the past several days. The Big Beautiful Bill is just more pork barrel nonsense coming to the United States. The Americans are broke. They have a record deficit. They have record deficits, and the deficit's only set to increase. The entire idea of DOGE, which President Trump was elected on, was to deal with that deficit, to rein in spending. But even as Musk worked for free to discover widespread fraud and abuse within the system, the House Republicans and the Senate have been very slow to work to codify any of those cuts and changes that would be necessary to start bringing things under permanent control. And Trump's so-called Big Beautiful Bill is just one big pork barrel. And there's a lot of people who celebrate it because Trump likes it, so they have to like it because it's a cult of personality. And it's never been about that for me personally. I always said that Trump was the best shot America had when compared to Harris or Biden, or even Hillary Rodham Clinton, but there were no guarantees it would work. And we're seeing a little bit of that now. Trump says, I would have won Pennsylvania regardless of Elon. I'm very disappointed with Elon. He knew this bill better than anyone, and he only developed a problem when he found out I would cut the EV mandate. That is fake news from the dawn. Elon was very aware, all through the election campaign, that the EV mandate would go. The electric vehicle credits were on the chopping block. But he supported Trump anyway because it was the best choice for America, even though it hurt him. And you see, I have to admire that in someone else because I've been in that position many times in my life where the decisions that I made hurt me personally but benefited those I represented. I've done it so many times. Not many people can do that. Self-interest is an all-consuming and all-powerful force. When I seen Elon set aside his own interests to the detriment of his companies, to the detriment of his projects. You see, the mass widespread attack that Tesla has come under, and not just Tesla, but every asset that Elon Musk holds, in a completely disproportionate outpouring of public hate for the man, simply because he tried to do his part to correct the horrendous state of U.S. public finances. And now, since he's remained consistent, able to criticize the so-called big, beautiful bill, which is definitely big, but far from beautiful, even though it hurts him, like he is beset by enemies. The only ally he had in this endeavor was the Trump administration. But because he's so able to do the right thing, he has now rightly criticized the president and his bill, even though it hurts his relationship with his ally at a time when he's beset by enemies because he allied himself with this man. And what does Trump do? What he always does. And in my opinion, it's shameful. We can do the play-by-play of Trump basically throwing Musk under the bus after all the service that Musk paid him, simply because he's rightly criticizing a bill. But let's just sum up Musk's criticism with his own words. Whatever. Keep the EV solar incentive cuts in the bill, even though no oil and gas subsidies are touched, which is inherently unfair. But ditch the mountain of disgusting pork in the bill. In the entire civilization, there has never been legislation that is both big and beautiful. Trump came to office largely on a vote to get rid of this pork, to get rid of the waste, fraud, and abuse, to balance the books and right the American ship. And Musk is holding him accountable. And because of that, Trump is now turning on him as an enemy. Musk asks, where is this guy today, as Jesse Pelton put together all of these various clips of Trump's previous words? Now, if this upsets you, you're not being unbiased. And this is a warning that I have oft repeated to everybody that watches this channel, even as I supported Trump's attempt to win the presidency yet again. And in the wake of everything that's been happening in Canada and the 51st state talk and everything else, comparing the superiority of the Constitution to this weak and corrupt federation that we all live under when we're speaking of Canada and its superiority, that the idea of the Constitution and the government of the United States and the system that they've designed being superior to Canada has nothing to do with the man or any individual that holds public office under that system. Place faith in God alone if you're going to put it anywhere, and use only reason for men. Trump is not an all-powerful being. He hits the can every single morning just like you. And we're seeing some of the flaws right now, which should make you, if you're Canadian, if you're somebody that's hopeful that Trump is going to ride in on a white steed and save Alberta and Saskatchewan and render Canada the 51st state, even though it makes absolutely no political sense to make this entire country one state, both from a perspective of how large it would be, the population, how liberal it would be, how automatically Democrat it would be if it even succeeded, how hard it would be to hold together if it was all just lumped in one thing. I often said in the past, Canada makes sense as 4 or 5 states. It doesn't make sense as one state. But these were all theoretical discussions. The hope that we have is that the provinces will stand up against the Federation. If you live in a province that is entirely up the Federation's backside, looking at Ontario and Quebec, I don't have much to say to you. My hope is resting in Alberta and Saskatchewan getting their act together and demanding as a baseline their provincial rights, but as an extension, separation in some way. Because I don't think the federal government's going to be nice to us no matter what we do. We're going to just have to do our own thing. And maybe it takes a little bit of time. But this idea that Trump's going to come in on a white steed and save us all and that it's all part of a movie and all you got to do is sit back and watch the show, you're putting faith in a man. So often I've seen the phrase, God wins. associated with Donald Trump. You're trying to have a reasonable discussion about the political situation in the United States and the relationship between America and Canada, and people say, have faith, God wins, as though God is embodied in the being of Donald Trump. Nothing could be further from the truth. And if you truly are a believer, if you truly are religious, if you truly are a Christian or a Jew or anybody of faith, the very notion is blasphemous. Which brings me to the concluding point of this video, which is Canadian politics right now. The one thing that I haven't discussed in any detail whatsoever is the current session of Parliament and the bills that are being proposed. There's not a lot of surprises. One of the first bills that Mark Carney's public safety minister proposed would put apps on your phone that can track your movement without your knowledge, just as a start. And the fact is they're using procedural finagling to avoid confidence votes, even though it's all a farcical theater, because I don't believe anybody's going to bring this government down weeks after it was elected. They'll come up with some reason to keep it and give it a try. I mean, it's fun to speculate. I've seen a number of YouTube videos with a number of thumbnails saying the government will fall this week, and it gets a lot of clicks. But I won't do that because I don't believe the government's going to fall. If it does, I'll start talking about it, okay? But in the meantime, all I see coming out of Ottawa is a bunch of pointless theater. One thing I will comment on. I did welcome a Conservative MP calling the actions of this government full communism. It was great to hear that. It was great that the Conservatives did that. But I had to note, the people delivering these strong messages are not members of the shadow cabinet. They're not highly placed. It's left to the backbenchers to test the waters. It's not bold. It's not brave. It's better, I guess, than it has been. But it still smacks of the same error the Conservative Party's always making, which isn't being bold enough, isn't shooting from the hip, isn't actually leading, isn't doing anything really different. We need courage right now. And I guess they're dipping their toe in courage. Hopefully they get the courage to just dive in. I think the whole thing is just pointless theater. They're going to vote on some motions. They're going to vote on this and that. And then today is Thursday. In 8 days, they go home for 3 months. The crisis with the United States and the great trade war is over with. The fact is, Carney and Trump have likely already figured out the exact deal they're going to sign, and everything else is virtue signaling. Now, we'll find out. But if your thesis is that Mark Carney is here to implement some of the World Economic Forum's agenda, as well as loot as much of Canada as possible, and leave us as bankrupt and weak as possible for members of his class to pick the bones clean of any meat that's left, well, then it makes sense. Everything makes sense. I'm Frank Vaughn. I'll see you in the next one.